On DIY Minded, I'm going to show you how I made the sawhorse inspired end table, all from a single construction grade 2x6. We start by breaking it down into more manageable pieces. I move over to the table saw and rip the pieces that will eventually be the tabletop itself. I'm not sure about where you live, but here, construction grade lumber does not come smooth and flat, so I have to flatten the edges. Here I'm using a table saw instead of using a jointer. The next part of the 2x6 is just cut a few times. Here we are working on the I-beam that goes underneath the tabletop. At the bandsaw, I rip one of these pieces lengthwise. Save your comments, I know, it's time for a new blade. Here you can see the entire 2x6 and how I've used each part of it so far. I try to sand as many of my components before assembly as possible. Saves me a lot of work later. Don't miss your opportunity to get your kids into the shop with you. Sanding is a great time to get the kids involved in your project. It's also a great time for some stimulating conversation. At this point, I start to glue up some of these sub-assemblies. Here, I'm starting with the I-beam that goes underneath the tabletop. Each one of the legs consists of 3 of these smaller strips. This wasn't the original plan, but this particular 2x6 had a lot of knots. A quick tip for doing large glue-up projects is to use a small paint roller. This particular roller I've been using for months. After I'm done, I wrap it up tight with a little bit of plastic wrap and store it for the next use. Make sure you take it off the roller frame first. These will all be clamped at the same time, but I'm only gluing them in groups of 3. I've often heard it said that woodworkers can never have enough clamps. This is never more evident than when doing a large glue up. Moving on to the tabletop, I arrange my pieces so there's no knots right next to each other. You can see here how effective this roller is at an even coat of glue. At this point, these are the scraps I have left from that original 10-foot 2x6. My next step is to cut the pieces for my bottom shelf. I decided to add some supports underneath the tabletop. Here I'm using my special washable, reusable glue spreader. You won't be able to find this anywhere online. After gluing, clamp it together and set it aside to dry with the other parts. When the clamps are removed, you can now see all the components for the table. All the glued up components get cleaned and sanded, ready for their final assembly. To get the cut and angle perfect for my legs, I used the trial and error method. I clamped a square board to the miter saw and set it at 15 degrees. This ended up being the perfect angle. Although the angle was perfect, the size was a little bit off. So after a couple of trial and error, I got it just the way I wanted it. Using a cross-cut sled, I clean up the edges on my tabletop. When working with angled or irregular shaped legs, I find it easiest to turn my project upside down on the workbench, and using a large square, I can mark the legs at the desired height. I'm going to be using 2 different methods to attach the legs to the table. The first method is going to be a countersunk screws. The second method that I'm using is an 1/8 inch dowel rod. I did not want to recess the leg into the lower part of the I-beam, so that left these 2 gaps here and here. By using a dowel rod, you will not be able to look in there and see screw threads. All 4 of the holes are filled with these wooden plugs. I did this to add a little bit of detail to the final project. The top will be attached with screws coming up through the support brackets that I added. When drilling the pilot holes, you can see I move the drill left to right. This will make an elongated hole which will hopefully prevent the tabletop from cracking over time. The tabletop support will be glued and screwed to the I-beam base. Make sure you countersink and pre-drill your screws. A crack at this point in the project would be devastating. Again, that special glue applicator is great for getting into tight spots. It is attached using a long, coarse-threaded screw. The framework for the bottom shelf is assembled using pocket holes. If you do a lot of DIY or woodworking and do not have a pocket hole jig, I would highly recommend it. It has to be the easiest method of joinery out there. I attached the bottom shelf frame to the legs with some screws. Make sure you pre-drill here as well. When drilling in tight spaces, use a long drill bit. You can see here, the long drill bit will actually flex, allowing the chuck of the drill to not scratch up my project. To attach the bottom shelf, you could just glue and clamp. I don't have a lot of patience, so I'm adding a few 23 gauge pins while the glue dries. The top is attached to the base by using 4 pan head screws up through the brackets that we installed earlier. This and a pile of sawdust is all that remains from the original 2x6. I spray the base with a 50-50 mix of water and acrylic wall paint. This allows the grain to still show through. I'm very happy with the final product, especially since it came from a board that cost me less than $5. The only downside is now my wife wants a second one for the other side of the couch. Thanks for watching DIY Minded. Please subscribe and share this video on social media.